Um, well, I was a prankster. Once I started going out with the girls, there used to be five of us always hanging out together, and I was a troublemaker. To be very truthful, I was very troublemaker. Not mean, but funny and fun. Um, my close girlfriend was getting married, but she made the mistake of telling me where they were going to have their apartment, and they were going to spend their honeymoon in the apartment. Rather than to take a trip, because they couldn't really. He was on the boats, the Rogers City Calcide boats, the husband-to-be, and so they were going to stay in their apartment. Well, it was in my hometown, so she told me where it was, and I knew the man that owned the apartments, and I asked him for a key because I wanted to straighten up the house and for her and get some food in the refrigerator. And he said, okay, Barb. He knew me. So I had a cowbell, and I took the cowbell and I crawled under the bed. Honest to God, you want this? And I hooked the cowbell to the spring and when they came back, well, the bed was used and the cowbell started ringing. And do you know what a cowboy bell is? Well, you know how big it is and how loud it is. Well, it awakened the owner of the apartments, and he went upstairs to see if there was something wrong because he heard this bell. So, and she said, when she opened the door, everybody had their noses out the apartment doors, wondering what this was. Yes, that was one of the things I did. But it was good 2 or 3 months. She wouldn't talk to me. She just wouldn't. She wouldn't even look at me. She was so mad. My name is Barbara Kwiatkoski. I was born and raised in Cheboygan, Michigan. It was a small town, not much to do, more farmery, more farms, and there was along the river, there was a lot of fishing huts. We did a lot of fishing, my brother Harold and myself, my dad. Like I was the youngest, and I would take my vacations from GM, and we'd fish on Mullet Lake. We'd go out there about 5:36 in the morning, come in about 11, go back at 5 and fish till 9. And during those times when I was younger, we lived a lot on fish. They would go fishing, and a perch was in our lakes, and it was really till the Indians were allowed to net, and we weren't. That kind of empty the. But one time, my brother and I were by ourselves fishing, and the water was real ripply, and it was damp, it was a little cool, and no sun. The fish were biting like crazy. The walleye, my brother was busy. Maybe I'll find a picture. My brother was fishing and handling the motor, and I was fishing. I picked in 24 of them. You're only allowed so many, but we had Mr. Rabishu lived on the lake, and he had a cooler. And so when we'd get our amount, we'd go and put it in the cooler. And he let us stay. And then at night, after everybody was quiet down, Harold and I would go out and get some and come in, clean them, freeze them, wrap them, freeze them, until we get and I took that picture of 24, and I'd say, this is what I caught. This is not what my brother caught. You brat. I was handling the motor. Yeah, I know. That's an excuse. So, but I teased the heck out of him because I caught all the 24 walleye, and I mean, they were big. They fight like crazy. The hardest fish I found to pull in was the bass, the green bass. We had brown and green bass. They were fighters. I went out spearing a couple times, but we were in shanties with spear. Have you ever seen those? In the wintertime, with our frozen lakes, and our inland lakes were frozen, like Mullet Lake, there was ice thick enough even on Duncan Bay that the men had built these, what they call them, fish houses, and they would made of tar paper and wood, and the flooring, they'd have room for a little stove in there. And there was a big hole that was in here, and this is where you would fish. Your spear was always in the water because you couldn't splash the water, it would chase everything away. Your spear had to be in that water all the time, and you had a tie to your hand for the spear, because if the fish, you hook it, that's going to pull, and you're going in that hole if you're not careful. So I know when I would go fishing the spearing, they would have me in a seat with a belt around me because I was lighter weight, and then they would be able to grab the spear and hold it on for me. But I didn't like spearing. You had to sit there quiet, and you had to sit there for so long watching through this hole for this fish to come through. I didn't like that. But while you're doing that, we had out on the ice itself, they had holes for tipods. Have those? You had it was like a tong type thing, and there was 3 tongs on the center, and you'd have your line tied to this, and then you'd have the bait in the hole. And then when you come out, the tipod, they had the little red ball on it, and when this little tipod was going up and down, you would know that there was a fish on it. But that was the fishing, and I love to fish, and I had to learn to clean them. My brother said, you pull them in, you clean them. My dad said, no, I'll do it for her. No, she has to clean it. And I had to bait my own hook, but my brother wouldn't let my father do it. So the only thing I would not bait my hook was what they call those suckers and you hook those to your hook, and they're alive. And not me. No, I'll do the worms. And we had to catch our own night crawlers. That was the other thing that's quite a challenge. You've never done that. You'd go out in the pitch dark on ground. You turned over ground that, like your garden or that, and you'd be a flashlight, and you'd be able to grab these worms before they dug down into the ground. I mean, you had your light on it, but you had to, so that your shadow, if you put a shadow on it, those things are gone. But so we had to catch our own night crawlers. And I had to bait my own hook. So I know that my dad and my brothers would go sometimes, and they'd go up into the lake up in Canada for smelt fishing. Remember the smelt? They'd come home with tubs of smelt, and we sat there cleaning them. And I had the job of washing. I didn't have to clean, didn't got the cut. The smelt, you didn't have to do too much. You just cut their heads off and clean the inside and then washed them. There was no scales or anything like that. And we didn't have the refrigeration either that nowadays. We did a lot of canning. We had chickens on the farm. We'd kill the chickens. We'd can the food. We'd can the chicken. We'd can the beef. We'd can the fish. The smelt, we used to do it in ketchup, mustard, and vinegar. I remember that. And we did a lot of canning. We had cellars. We had one cellar with apples. We used to wrap the apples in newspaper and put them in the sand in the cellar. The carrots and that would do the same thing. Put the carrots and everything in the sand in the cellar. And that's how we kept our refrigeration for our milk or whatever was in our deep wells. We had what they called flowing wells, and our house was one of them that had a real nice flowing well. And we'd tie our milk with cord, and we'd put the bottles or whatever we had into the well itself, and that's how we kept it. I graduated to ice boxes, where the icemen used to come around with bricks of ice that they would cut off in Lake Huron or Duncan Bay. They'd cut this ice out, and they used to have ice houses where they had sawdust. We had a sawdust mill in Michigan, in Cheboygan, and they take this sawdust and put it and cover this ice up with the sawdust. That apparently that's kept it in bricks. And we used to have the icemen come around, and they had these great big tongs, they were big tongs. They take this brick of ice, take it into our house and drop it into the top of our refrigerator, ice box. And that's how everything kept cold. And they would come around. The ice box used to last maybe 2 weeks, and they'd have to have another ice box. Now we had what they call our newspapers, and we had wings that used to come around with their wagon and a horse. And they would have milk, and sometimes they'd have ice cream, not often because it couldn't keep it cold. Sometimes they would have maybe potatoes that they would deliver. You'd buy a bushel of potatoes or that from them. But that's how our milk was delivered, not in trucks and not in cars, but by this wagon with a horse. And then we had a vegetable garden but then our streets in my hometown, they started putting new asphalt down, and I got roller skates for outside, and I had in the neighborhood kids, about 8 of them, all skating with me from one end of the highway to the other. So that was my youth. I skated and roller. That was my time. And at 16, I started to take lessons. And I was in a parade, and also I danced for a group of people. And that ended, and I was in Mullet Lake, and the place burned down. So that was the end of my skating. My teenage years was a little hampered because my mother left when I was 12 years old, and she didn't come back till I was 25. So through the years, I was with my father, and as being the youngest and going to school, I was kind of held in the home doing my mother's work, which she should have been. But it worked out okay. Everything turned out, and I am what I am today because of it. My family life, I was my 2 sisters. The oldest one married when she was 16 and had 3 children. My next sister was she was 27 when she died, and she had 3 children. My brother Virgil had many children. He was like little Jesus, loved him and leave him. So I had brother Donald, rather quiet and conservative. I was born into a family that was in Catholic only and name only. Next door was my father's brother, who had married a French Canuck, and very religious. So we had that on the left. Now, my father sailed on the boats, on outside ocean boats. He was considered a merchant marine. And so my uncle is the one that kind of kept track on my 3 brothers. 2 of the brothers had died early. So he had the hand to control my brothers. My mother knew only the switch and the razor strap. And the razor strap, if you remember right, they had 3 straps on it. And Dad used to sharpen his straight razor on this sharp. And I think I still have one, I'm not sure, as a memento. But yeah, and but my mother ruled viciously with the straps and the switches. And Uncle Joe took over the rest of it. And I didn't, like I said, I went to the public school. All of us went to the public school from my sister Lydell and on. But my Uncle Joe always made sure that everyone had been raised as Catholics. We had to go to Saturday school. During the week, we had to go to the Catholic school to get our religious education from the Baltimore Catechism and the nuns. We had the Religious Sisters of Mercy. and our St. Mary's. The Dominions were in St. Charles, and I don't know where it was in Rogers City, but that was it. And like I said, I didn't go to St. Mary's until the 3rd grade, and from which through the 12th grade, that's where I graduated from. The nuns were very strict. We weren't allowed slacks or jeans or anything like that. We didn't have uniforms, but we had to have feminine clothes. No writings or any advertising on any of the shirts or blouses. And the boys had jeans, or what they could afford, and different shirts. They didn't have to have white shirts or starched collars or anything. They were just casual pullovers or whatever. And that's what our dress was for. And it went through like that for the 12 years I was in there. We never could wear slacks in the school. And the other things, the nuns always conveyed to us, no chewing gum. If you don't chew gum unless you're in your own bedroom, because when you're chewing gum, it's like a cow chewing his cud. So we were limited. In even high school, from the 9th grade on, the ladies, the women, the girls were not allowed to wear makeup. We could never make up. We only started wearing makeup after we graduated from the 12th grade. And then from the 12th grade, I didn't know what I was going to do. I couldn't afford college. So I went to County Normal. If you remember, it's a teacher's training school. And I went there for 2 years. And then I had to matriculate at Central Michigan State Teachers College, which is now CMU. It's a university now, but it was known as, it's in Mount Pleasant, and it was known as a teacher's college. So I matriculated there. I spent 2 days taking tests, and they were thick, long tests to get my teacher's certificate. I was able to teach for 2 years on that teaching certificate. To extend it, I had to take extension courses through U of M, and they were in the courthouse in Cheboygan. So I took those after teaching during the daytime. I took the extension courses. So I taught for the 2nd year, but then I realized I didn't belong behind that desk. So I left, and I was able to get an employment with A&P, and I worked with them for 3 years as a head checker and assistant bookkeeper. And then they moved to Cadillac. They moved to Cadillac. They closed up in Cheboygan. So I went down to Utica, Michigan, stayed with my brother, and that's when I got the job with GM. And that's where I worked myself up to having my own office with 3 individuals that I was responsible for. I started out with a file room, and that is sorting materials to be filed away. Then I went to quality control. I was promoted to quality control. And then I went for tech services for a while, and then they promoted me again. And I was in an office. I did a lot of research for, I remember when DeLorean had this lawsuit. I was working for Jim at that time, and I was working with some of the lawyers doing the research because I had all the file knowledge that they needed, and I was able to recoup everything they needed. And I received many letters from the lawyers that I worked for in accommodation for what I had accomplished for them. And they said that the DeLorean lawsuit wouldn't have been won without my research and help. I also I did the research for the Corvette. If you remember, they had a trouble with the Corvette. And I did research with the lawyers again. Again, I was rewarded with that, with more promotion and more money. So that was important. The latter was important. Anyhow, then we had I think it was a Corvair that we had that trouble with. And I was working with them, and they went up to the St. Sue Marie, because it was wintertime, and they were having trouble with the motors. And they got up there, and the weather had changed to warm. So they moved down lower to Sault Ste. Marie, and they had colder weather. But all their reports came the engineers gave their reports from Sault Ste. Marie, which was false, because I had to report the weather conditions and everything for the lawyers, and they had to go back and revamp all their information and they told me I should never have done that, but I was telling the truth. So, and it was very interesting. But I was awful glad they start downsizing, and I had the opportunity to go as a consultant. Mr. Paul Olser was with the excuse me, was with the computers, and he had trained me to be a consultant between Pontiac, Flint, and Warren, Michigan, with the Chevrolet engineering. And they didn't want to lose me, but I had married Ken in '76, and when Paul asked me to be the consultant, I mean, I had my retirement, but I could be on call whenever they needed me. And Ken, my husband, said, no, we're traveling. So we did. That's where we started traveling. We went across from Cheboygan. We picked up my aunt and uncle in Long Beach, and we would travel all the way through Montana, all the way out to Newfoundland. Ken was stationed out there, so all of that was interesting too. And then we came back, and we went to South America. We went to the islands and the Grand Canaries. We were surprised in the beach in Panema, and my husband and the friends that we're with, John and Ken, when we got to the lake, and we lived right across the street in the hotel, and we got dressed to go over to the beach. Well, John and Ken ran into the water, but they were walked on top of the water coming out because it was so cold. And you know, we noticed that all the people on the beach were still there with their blankets and taking the sun. We didn't see anybody in the water. Then we realized why we didn't see any water. But that was interesting. We went to Bora Bora, and that's a French place. And we bicycled around the island, and we came to the fact that they don't tie up their dogs, and they were loose. And we encountered a few attacks, but we always threw our bicycles at them, so they went away. And it was the other thing I noticed in Bora Bora, that they were picking coconuts. The men were on the side taking care of the children. The women were up in the trees knocking the coconuts down. And I thought, wow, what a difference. We and Americans wouldn't do that. So those were some interesting spots. Well, Ken and I, their house, they lived in the house right around the corner from us, on Vale Street and on Sutherland. There was my cousins, two, Lucille and Mariel, and myself and Pete, and Ken and his brother. We'd all meet on the corner and walk to school, to St. Mary's School. And we went to school together. Well, Ken came to St. Mary's in fifth grade. He had gone to the public school, the same one that I had left. I was 2 years in the Galbraith school, which was a public, and I didn't move over to the Catholic school until the third grade. Ken didn't move into the St. Mary's, the Catholic school, until the fifth grade. And we went to school through all the grades together. And he got in trouble with the nuns. Ken had a photographic memory, and he didn't have to study. I mean, he could look at a page and do just magnificently, he could come up with it. Shorthand, excellent. Typing, faster than I could ever type. But he was working at Norland in the evenings and cooking and making extra money. The family we weren't rich through there, we were all poor. And the nuns got angry with him because they knew he wasn't studying, and so they told his father that he either had to quit Norland and come to school, or he was out of the school. So he left. He left the school, and he joined the Army in 1950. And after the Korean broke out. And then he was shipped to Korea. And then from Korea, he was Vietnam. And he had 3 hitches in Vietnam. He was a field officer. He earned his ranks in the field. He didn't go to school or anything out of lieutenants or anything. He was major. He was commissioned major from the field officer. And he had a lot of men, women under him that he was responsible for. When we first married, and I had been independent, there was 15 years between my first marriage and my annulment to marrying Ken. So I was an independent person, as one would know and can still tell. But I had to do a little compromising, and so did he. And sometimes when we had a few arguments, because nothing ever goes smoothly, I would have to tell him, Ken, you're not my commanding officer. And I would walk away. I would not continue the argument, I'd just walk away. After everything had settled down and he was sitting down or relaxing, I'd say, go into him. I sat down, we have to talk. And that's how we did the rest of the time. And that's how and it wasn't one time I had to tell him he wasn't my commanding officer. There was several times. We traveled until we moved out here in Boulder City, and then he got tied up with the board, the association board, and that was his priority. And that was the end of it. And then he passed away in 2010, and I stayed here because of my friends and the closeness I had with them. So none of my family was in the service except my father, who was considered a merchant marine. He was sailing the Great Lake, and he was never home. He sailed from, I would say, from May or June, April, May, right in there, till October. Sometimes he was able to come home for a weekend or 2 days. So we never saw him till he left the boats and came back to work in Cheboygan on the straits from Mackinac City to St. Ignace till the bridge was built, and then the boats were gone. Then he got a job in St. Ignace on the boats that used to cross the straits. It was the straits off Lake Huron, and it went into Lake Michigan and all through there, the 5 lakes. He was sailing the boats in from that cross because it was before the bridge was built. And I think the bridge was finally opened up in 1950, I think, but I'm not positive. But he worked on the straits that went from Mackinac City to St. Ignace for those years. He was a deckhand, and then he was a watchman, and he also did some cooking. But that was the extent of it. And then he retired, and Dad was a bootlegger. My father made his own whiskey, his own beer, his own wines, and he would have it in his cart. It was big wheels cart and wooden frame, and he'd be pushing these down, and that's how he had an old Dodge truck that he was able to push this cart up on the Dodge truck and go out to Mullet Lake where there was money of the elite people, and he'd sell this vegetables for them, but he'd also have to sell his bootleg liquor. At our home, our front steps, and the police knew what he was doing, and they tried to catch him. But as long as he was in his own house, they used to have dance parties in the house, honest to God. And for seating, we had a stairway, and they put 2x4s to one side, and 2x4s to one, and then we had the archway for the door, then the dining room, the same thing. That's where the people sat. We had 2 local musicians that used to come over and play. They would take their turns, and they'd have parties down there. And Dad was able to serve his liquor in his house. But what he did with the supply was, as they came, and as the police would come in, and FBI too, I don't really know. I know that the uniforms would come in, and they'd be searching for his supply. Could never find his supply. They'd dig around the house and everything, never found his supply. What he did, he put steps in the front of the house with a platform for the porch type thing, steps. And underneath, he had this, it had to be about a 5-by-6 cellar dug into the front steps of the stairway. And they had, the cellar door was on the top set. And what they did was put a scrape, the cellar door, nobody noticed that because they put like a thick mat, and it was put over that door. They could never see the door. In fact, when Ken and I, finally, we were going to do the revamping of the steps and the porch in the front, we found this cellar. And we found the old-fashioned capper to cap on the bottom. We found it, but we didn't find anything else but this old cap. But we had it, and we had a man that collected old pieces, and he bought it from us. But finally, we sealed that cellar. So, but that's where he kept all his stash, right in front of him, and nobody ever found that cellar. Oh yes, my father and my family was notorious. This is how he fed us. I mean, we as kids, we were on welfare. I mean, and then Roosevelt put this for the highways, the WPA, and my father was working on the WPA. In fact, he was working on the highway that went right behind our house. Then Roosevelt was it that put the CC camps. We had the CC camps in Cheboygan, and that was for the wayward young men that they didn't know it. They were, instead of going to jail, they went into the CC camp under guards, and so we had all of that there. I can remember some of it. I can remember some of the problems we had with the CC camp. The young men would have a break, go downtown and drink or whatever they could get. But that was one thing, they would come to the house thinking that Dad would sell them some booze or whatever, and he would never do that. He said, no, I'll go hungry first before I give you a bottle of it. And also, Dad was a good baker. He used to bake bread. And oh my God, this homemade bread was outstanding. And he'd bake like 20 loaves at a time. He had these 2 great big dish pans like they would make it, and we'd watch this bread rise. Have you ever seen that? You know, we watch this bread rise, and after it got so high, then we'd take it and start making biscuits or the bread rolls and bake and put it in the pans, and we did all of it. I helped with some of it. I helped with canning. I didn't like canning too well, unless it was beets, because I used to like to get the beets and slide this. The outside would just slide right off. After you put the hot water on it, it'd just slide right off. So I liked the beets. The hot peppers, the banana peppers, oh, those were horrible. But you had to wear gloves to can those because you'd burn the heck out of your hands. Yeah, something like, let's see, what else? The coal was delivered by trucks or by horse and buggy, by sleds, in the wintertime by sleds. And we used to have what they call the coal shed in the back, and they would we'd order a load of coal, and they'd fill that up in the back. In fact, Ken's father used to deliver it to our house. He worked for Cole's Dock, and he used to deliver coal to our house. I can remember that. You had to have stamps for the meat. You had to have stamps for the sugar. You had to have stamps for hosiery. And you couldn't get hosiery because they were using those for the military. A couple of the elderly lady that I knew left their families home with the elderly child, taking care of them, and they went to Detroit to be called, what was that called? Rosie the Riveter. Remember that? They left only to take the place of the men, because the men were called to the service, and the replacements were the women in the factories and that. So I remember some of the families that were broken up because of that, but the women left their home with the elderly taking care of them, because somebody had to bring in the money. Somebody had to bring in food. Because, during that time, there was a lot of welfare. Yeah, probably. And the welfare wasn't like what they have now. The welfare was the basics of maybe rice, raisins, prunes, beans, limited amount of milk, unless you were fortunate like to live near a farmer, which we were. And we have these books for gas. I remember the Holden books. I think they were Holden books. Just the name came to me. One book was in green stamps and the other was in red stamps. Do you remember any of that? And yeah, and like I say, welfare, and I can remember wearing welfare clothes. Everything was brown and orange. To this day, I kind of stay away from those two colors. The brown snowsuits, the brown socks, the brown orange. Oh yes, I remember that. I was the youngest, but every time they would have trouble with their wives or their kids or anything, they'd come home to me. I was the mediator for my brothers and sisters. They'd get in arguments with one another, especially over their kids. They would say this, and all of a sudden Harold wasn't talking to Louise, or Louise wasn't talking, and I'd say, what's the problem? Well, she said this to the kid, and I'd sit them down and we'd talk, and then I said, well, wait a minute, now we got this talked out. Let's bring in these two children that you're fighting over. And they'd say, well, I said, just bring them in here. So we'd sit down in the kitchen and they'd bring in these two little brats and would say, what's your problem? The father and mother sat there, shut your mouth. I'm dealing with this. And I'd say, what's your problem? Why are you fighting with her? Or why are you fighting with him? He blah, 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 blah. Okay. Why are you fighting with him? Well, he just said this. I said, why? Why are you fighting over it? And not only that, but you're also making your mother and dad fight over this. Is this what you want? No. Then for God's sake, straighten up. And they would. And I'd say, if there was two Hellas, I'd say, when you walk out of here, you shake hands. If you're girls, you put your hands around, you hold her hands and walk out. No more of this. And Bob, it settled it. And anytime the wives would have trouble with my brothers, Barb, I don't know what to do. Wait a minute, I'm not married. I don't know. So what's the matter with you? Well, and I'd say, okay, I know the problem with my brother. So I'd talk to him. And I'd say, is this true? Yes. Then change, damn it, change. You want a divorce? No, then change. So, yeah, I was the mediator. Right up to every one of them that died. What I learned in my 92 years, accept the things that you cannot change, and to change the things that you can, and do the very best.